The evening found Caleb Ashford stacking firewood as the sun slipped low and bruised along the Wyoming plain, its light thinning like breath on cold glass. Each log landed with a dull certainty, the sound of a man convincing himself that endings could be orderly if he kept his hands busy. He had counted the stacks twice already, not because they needed counting, but because numbers obeyed him when people never had. The ranch stood quiet behind him, boards creaking as if remembering better years, and the wind carried the smell of sage and something older, almost like regret. He told himself he was ready to leave by morning, yet the land listened without agreeing, and that disagreement lingered. He had learned to live with quiet the way some men lived with wives, accepting its moods, forgiving its long silences. At 30, Caleb wore solitude like a coat he never took off, stitched from losses he did not name anymore. Folks in town said he was decent but distant, a man who paid his debts and kept his eyes low, which was their way of saying he did not belong anywhere loud. The ranch had been his mother's last wish and his last promise, and promises, he believed, were meant to be kept until they wore thin. He set another log down and felt the night watching him, as though the land itself wondered what would happen if he truly walked away. That was when he sensed her, not as a sound but as a pause in the wind, a hush that did not belong to the evening. Caleb straightened slowly, fingers stiff with cold and habit, and saw her standing near the fence where the cottonwoods leaned like tired men. She did not wave or call out, only waited, wrapped in a faded shawl the color of dusk after rain. Her presence unsettled the order he had built around himself, because nothing unexpected had crossed that fence in years. He told himself she would speak first, yet something in her stillness asked him not to rush, and that request held him. When she finally stepped closer, the gravel did not crunch beneath her boots, as if the ground had chosen mercy. Her eyes were dark and steady, but the tears clinging there betrayed a long road and longer nights. "Sir," she said, voice low, as though she feared the word might break if lifted too high, "I can work." He noticed then how young she was, though wear had made her careful, and how her hands trembled even while she held them still. Caleb had learned to refuse gently, but the tears changed the shape of his answer before he could speak. He nodded toward the woodpile and told her there was stacking to be done, and in that small permission, something shifted. She set to work without complaint, lifting logs heavier than her frame suggested, breath fogging the air in quick, controlled bursts. Caleb watched from a distance, pretending to busy himself with the fence, though his attention never left her careful movements. Every few minutes, he wondered what kind of courage it took to ask a stranger for work at the edge of nowhere, and what kind of fear made silence safer than explanation. The wind tugged at her shawl, revealing a bruise at her wrist that she quickly hid, and the sight tightened something in him he thought had gone numb. He told himself it was none of his business, yet his gaze kept returning, betraying him. As the last light faded, he offered her water and a heel of bread, leaving them on the porch rail as if generosity required distance. She thanked him with a nod, eyes lowered, and ate like someone who had learned not to expect seconds. Caleb noticed how she flinched at distant voices drifting from the road, laughter edged with the kind of judgment that traveled faster than truth. He wondered which town had turned her away and what words had been used to make that turning feel righteous. The ranch felt smaller with those questions pressing in, and the firewood stacks looked less like preparation and more like a wall. He showed her the lean-to where she could sleep for the night, explaining nothing about his plans or his rules, because he had none he trusted anymore. She listened carefully, committing every word to memory as though survival depended on accuracy. When she thanked him again, her voice steadied, and for a moment he saw not fear but resolve, sharp and bright as flint. Caleb returned to his cabin alone, the quiet altered by her breathing on the other side of the wall, and he lay awake wondering why the thought of morning no longer felt simple. The night stretched thin, and somewhere between the creak of timber and the whisper of wind, he heard her crying, muffled but persistent. It was not loud enough to demand action, yet it refused to be ignored, threading through him like a question he had avoided too long. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped, recalling every time he had chosen silence because it asked less of him. Outside, the firewood waited, stacked and steady, bearing witness to a man who had learned how to endure but not how to stay. He did not cross the wall, but he did not sleep either, and the waiting became its own kind of promise. Morning arrived pale and undecided, frost etching the world in fragile lines. She was already awake, sweeping the lean-to with a care that suggested gratitude had become habit. Caleb poured coffee into 2 cups without remark, setting one near her elbow as if it had always belonged there. She looked up then, surprised, and he saw her fully for the first time, the strength in her posture, the caution in her smile, the quiet dignity that had survived every closed door. She told him her name was Ayana Red Willow, and the sound of it lingered like a song he had forgotten he knew. They worked side by side without conversation, the rhythm of labor filling the spaces words might have broken. Ayana's movements were efficient, practiced, and Caleb wondered where she had learned such endurance and at what cost. When a board splintered under her hand, he fetched a cloth and wrapped it gently, careful not to touch more than needed, yet aware of the weight carried in that restraint. She met his eyes then, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition that kindness could exist without ownership. The ranch, once so certain in its loneliness, seemed to listen more closely. By midday the road carried rumors before it carried people, and Caleb felt the pressure of the world inching nearer. He knew how quickly generosity could be named foolishness, how easily her presence could invite trouble he had spent years avoiding. Ayana sensed the shift and began to gather her things, assuming what always followed grace was departure. Caleb watched her prepare to leave and felt the old instinct to let things end before they demanded courage. He opened his mouth to speak, uncertain of the words, and the moment hung between them, fragile and full. Caleb found his voice before he found his courage, and even that came quietly. He asked Ayana where she planned to go, though he already knew the answer would be nowhere that welcomed her. She paused with her bundle half-tied, the morning light catching on her cheek like something trying to stay. "I will keep moving," she said, not bitter, only certain, as if motion itself were the last thing no one could take from her. The words settled between them, heavy with roads untraveled, and Caleb felt the ache of all the times he had chosen movement over meaning. He told her then that he had meant to leave this place, that the firewood was never for winter but for closure, and that running had once felt like the only honest skill he possessed. Ayana listened without interruption, her eyes steady, as though she understood the language of departure better than most. When he finished, the silence did not rush to fill the space, but stayed gentle, giving both of them room to breathe. Outside, the ranch seemed to lean closer, curious what a man might do when he finally named his fear. The road answered before either of them could decide, carrying the sound of hooves and voices sharpened by purpose. Two men from town rode up, their gazes landing on Ayana with the easy entitlement of those who believed the world arranged itself for their comfort. They spoke of laws and propriety, of women who wandered too far from where they were told to stand, and Caleb felt the old reflex to step aside, to let inevitability pass through him untouched. But Ayana did not move behind him, and that quiet defiance rooted him where he stood. Caleb did not raise his voice or his fists. He simply said she was staying if she wished, and that was the truth he would stand with. The men laughed at first, then frowned, unsettled by the calm that met their certainty. Ayana stepped forward, her voice clear, her back straight, naming herself not as someone's burden or debt, but as her own keeper. The words did not change the world all at once, but they changed the shape of the moment, and the riders left with less confidence than they arrived. When the dust settled, the ranch exhaled, and so did Caleb. They stood there afterward, unsure how to name what had just been claimed. No promises were made, no grand declarations offered, only the shared understanding that staying was an act of courage neither had practiced before. Ayana asked if the work still needed doing, and Caleb nodded, handing her a log as if it were an invitation rather than a task. Together they stacked the firewood again, each piece placed with care, building not a wall but a future that required patience. The rhythm of their work stitched the morning into something that felt earned. Seasons passed without ceremony, marked by small rituals and steady trust. Caleb learned the sound of Ayana's laughter, rare but honest, and she learned the shape of his silences, which no longer meant absence. They shared meals, stories spoken when ready, and grief that softened when held between two people. The ranch changed too, its loneliness loosening its grip, the land responding to hands that stayed. When they married, it was quietly, witnessed by wind and sky, a union built not from rescue but from recognition. Years later, the firewood stacks stood taller than ever, a testament to winters faced together. Caleb would sometimes pause in his work, watching Ayana move through the yard with a confidence that had grown roots, and marvel at the life that had come from a moment he nearly walked away from. He understood then that dignity was not granted by others but chosen, again and again in the face of fear. The ranch was no longer a place he endured, but a place he belonged. And if you are listening to this as someone who has stood at the edge of leaving, know this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay when staying feels unbearable. Sometimes seeing another's tears is an invitation to see your own, and in that seeing to begin again. Life does not always ask for grand gestures. Often it asks only that you stack the firewood, one careful piece at a time, and trust that warmth will come.